fog rolled over the swamps, hiding the rotting tombstones. Against the backdrop of a crimson sunset, the dark silhouette of the Harris estate looked less like a home and more like a monument to an ancient tragedy. No one dared to go near it, especially at night. The old folks whispered that from the broken windows one could hear a woman's cry. "It's her, the weeping bride," they said, "waiting for the groom who will never come." Emily Brooks had heard these legends since childhood. Now at 25, she had returned to her hometown of Winston, a small American town in the middle of nowhere. As a journalist, she wanted to write an article about local ghost stories. And of course, the most terrifying of them all was the tale of the weeping bride. Emily checked into a motel on the outskirts of town. Her first destination was the old cemetery near the Harris estate. The rain came suddenly, cold droplets tapping against her umbrella. She moved between the crooked headstones when she saw it. Standing at the farthest grave was a figure, a woman in an old wedding dress. A long veil covered her head, and her hands hung lifelessly at her sides. Emily froze. Her heart pounded violently. The woman slowly began to turn her head toward her. Emily swallowed hard. Thick fog coiled around her legs, and the cold crept under her clothes, seeping into her skin. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure in the wedding dress. The woman turned slowly, too slowly, as if resisting some unseen force. Then Emily saw her face. The skin was deathly pale, the lips dry and cracked, but the eyes were completely empty. Only darkness reflected in them. Water dripped from beneath the sheer veil, as if it had soaked up the dampness of the other world. Emily took a step back, but her heel sank into the wet ground. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. The woman raised her hand and stretched it toward Emily. "Can you see me?" The voice was weak, as if traveling through deep water. Emily wanted to scream, but all she could do was gasp for air. The figure stepped forward. The earth beneath her feet rippled, as though she were standing on quicksand. A faint whisper echoed around them, countless voices speaking all at once, yet the words were incomprehensible. Emily couldn't take it anymore. She turned and ran, stumbling over graves and muddy puddles. Behind her, a long, mournful wail carried through the night. She burst into her motel room, slammed the door shut, and leaned against it, gasping for breath. The room was dark, lit only by the dim glow of a streetlight filtering through the curtains. It was just my imagination, she tried to convince herself. But she had seen her. With trembling hands, Emily opened her laptop. She had to write everything down. "Tonight, I went to the cemetery near the old Harris estate. The legend of the weeping bride is not just a story. I saw her. I heard her voice. But who is she, and what does she want?" She finished typing and closed her laptop. Then outside the window, something rustled. Emily froze. A thin white figure slipped past the glass. She was here. The next morning, Emily headed to the local library. She needed to dig up every possible record about the weeping bride. According to legend, years ago, a young woman named Lillian Harris lived in the estate. On her wedding day, her fiancé, Henry Caldwell, vanished without a trace. Weeks later, his body was pulled from the river, but the cause of death remained a mystery. Lillian never recovered from the loss. On the day she was supposed to wear her wedding dress, she never took it off. In despair, she walked into the swamps and disappeared. Later, townsfolk found her veil tangled in the branches of a dead tree. Her body was never recovered. Since then, her ghost had been seen near the estate, eternally searching for her lost groom. "You've seen her too, haven't you?" a voice said behind her. Emily spun around. An elderly woman with thin, wispy gray hair stood before her. "What? The weeping bride? You saw her, didn't you?" Emily swallowed hard. "Yes, but who are you?" The woman sighed heavily and sat down at a nearby table. "My name is Margaret Harris. I am the last of the Harris bloodline, and I know how her curse began." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Tell me everything." Margaret's gaze darkened. "But you must be ready, because if she has seen you, she will never let you go." Margaret Harris sat across from Emily in the musty library. Her hands trembled as she turned the yellowed pages of an old album. "Lillian was the last hope of the Harris family," she began. "Our bloodline was dying out, generation after generation. Her father, Edgar Harris, was obsessed with continuing the lineage. He chose a groom for her, Henry Caldwell." Emily listened carefully, scribbling notes. "But Henry, he never loved Lillian." Margaret let out a bitter laugh. "It was just a deal. Her father promised him land, influence, and wealth. But the night before the wedding, he vanished." "Was he murdered?" Emily asked. Margaret slowly nodded. "His body was found in the river weeks later, but the strange thing was, he hadn't drowned. His lungs were dry." Emily frowned. "What? How is that possible?" Margaret pressed her lips into a thin line. "They say Lillian knew more than she let on. That night, she disappeared from the house. And in the morning, they found her near the swamp, covered in mud, her dress torn." She exhaled sharply. "The servants swore they heard her speaking to someone who wasn't there." "You mean," she called upon something to take revenge. A chill ran down Emily's spine. "What exactly?" Margaret looked her straight in the eye. "The weeping bride." Emily couldn't shake Margaret's words from her mind. She had to return to the Harris estate. The night was bright with moonlight. The house stood shrouded in darkness, its empty windows like hollow eyes. Emily stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked under her weight. The air reeked of dampness and decay. On the second floor, she found an old mirror. Its frame was covered in cobwebs, the glass clouded and dull. As she moved closer, something appeared on the surface. A face. Lillian. Her lips moved soundlessly. Emily staggered back, but something grabbed her wrist. She turned. No one was there. But the mirror cracked. The cracked mirror trembled as if it were alive. Thin fractures spread across its surface like a web spun by an unseen hand. Emily froze, staring at the reflection. Lillian's face was right in front of her, pale as wax with dark hollows where her eyes should have been, eyes filled with endless sorrow. Her lips trembled, but Emily couldn't hear a single sound. Then Lillian opened her mouth. A whisper slithered into Emily's mind, wrapping around her thoughts like a cold, sticky fog. "He lied. He lied to me. He did not love me." The words echoed in the empty room, though Lillian's lips did not move. Emily took a step back and felt something wet and sticky beneath her feet. The floor had turned into a rotting black sludge. She screamed, yanking her arm free from the unseen grip. The moment she did, the mirror shattered into thousands of shards, and an eerie silence swallowed the room. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She had to get out. Now. But when Emily turned toward the exit, she saw that the doorway was no longer empty. A bride stood there. Lillian. Her dress was torn and soaked in a dark, viscous liquid. Her veil dripped with something that smelled of rot. Slowly, Lillian raised a hand and dragged her fingers across her throat. "Will you betray him too?" Her voice was dry, brittle, like dead leaves rustling in the wind. Emily took a step back. No, I just want to know the truth." Lillian tilted her head to the side. And then she vanished. The doorway was open again. Emily didn't hesitate. She bolted down the stairs, refusing to look back. As she burst out of the estate into the cold night air, she thought she had escaped. But it was a lie. The weeping bride knew her name now, and she wasn't going to let her go. Emily sat in her motel room, hugging herself. Why had the weeping bride chosen her? That night, she dreamed. She stood in an old ballroom, dimly lit by flickering chandeliers. Shadows swayed, their movements slow and deliberate. They were dancing. Men in tuxedos, women in flowing gowns. Their faces were blurred, as if erased from a photograph. Lillian stood in the center. Her wedding dress was pure white, like on the day of her wedding. She reached out her hand. "Dance with me." Emily's feet moved on their own. She didn't want to, but her body refused to obey. The music grew louder. Lillian's hands were as cold as marble. Her black eyes gleamed. "Your groom, did he betray you too?" "What?" Lillian squeezed her fingers. "They all lie." The music stopped. Emily woke up screaming. Her hands were ice cold. But that wasn't the worst part. On her finger was a wedding ring. Emily had to find the truth. At the library, she uncovered a letter. Lillian's letter. "Henry, if you do not come, I will curse this day. Let your lies echo in the darkness. Let all who stand between me and my vows feel my sorrow." Emily's blood ran cold. This was not just a ghost. This was a curse. The archive door creaked open. Emily turned. But she already knew who was standing there. Lillian smiled. "Now you are mine." No one in Winston ever heard from Emily Brooks again. But if you walk past the Harris estate at night, you might hear two voices singing the wedding march. Once a bride, always a bride.